I knew I would be released sooner or later. Either that or I would be quietly done away with in some obscure cell.
Even within Nigeria, we'll see the end, we'll terminate this vicious cycle of dictatorship in a very short time.
You cannot sit down and say you're writing a poem when next door somebody is being raped or violated in some way. You can write about it afterwards, but you know you're compelled to take action at that point, or you cease to be a human being.
Welcome to Wole Soyinka, and hello to everyone, whether you're in the room or watching on the live stream. I'm Mishal Husain from the BBC, and it's my privilege to be here with Wole Soyinka, someone who has embodied so much of the spirit in which we gather today. And thank you, Tina, for bringing us all together. Wole has embodied it in his life and work, in his actions, as well as his writing. So it's a pleasure to be with you. You are approaching, Wole, a very special milestone, which is your 90th birthday next month.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
And there are two films being made about Wole Soyinka in this year, but I wonder if we could begin with going right back to the Nigeria under British colonial rule in which you grew up. You were born in 1934. Your mother called you the questioner, I think, which is very much in line with the spirit of this summit. What were you questioning?
Yeah, that was one of the nicer things she called me. She called me many. I questioned everything. I used the word curious. I was a very curious child. I remained a curious person, you know. I just want to see. Not as bad as those who walk past a workplace and they see "do not touch" and they touch. No, it wasn't that bad, but it was pretty close. Everything.
I think, but paint a picture of the society and the environment, because, as I said, it's British colonial rule at the time, but where you grew up in Western Nigeria, you had local traditions, you had the influence of Christianity, your father was a teacher. It seems to me it was an unusual household, like a focal point for the community.
It was unusual, and unusual in the sense, in a comparative sense. We lived in a Christian compound, a parsonage it was called, but next door there was a Muslim community, family at least. There was a mosque somewhere there. On the other side there was the traditional healer. In fact, next to my mother's shop, she kept a little small commodity shop. And I used to listen to the incantations of the traditional healer, the diviner. And all these various religions seem to have no problem living with one another, well, compared to what's happening today.
Yes.
That's what is depressing.
And actually we should probably reflect on that a little bit immediately, because I'm conscious that it's 10 years this year since the Chibok schoolgirls were taken from their boarding school, and about 100 of them, their fate is still unknown. When would you say that strand of extremism, fundamentalism started to develop in your country?
It's the disease of the world which has come to infect our society as well. And in fact, not just Nigeria, but swathes of the West African, just south of the Sahel, and parts of East Africa as well. And it seems to apply to all religions, but of course more spectacularly and tragically in the case of the Islamic fundamentalists. All this fundamentalism everywhere, but those who believe in the violent aspect, they unfortunately seem to attach more to one religion. That happens to be a fact. Many people don't like to hear it, but it is the truth. It is what we experience. And the cause of it, of course, includes even political ambition. Because even if something is within society, the opportunists, the political opportunists, then mobilize and utilize and maximize the differences. And before you know where you are, neighbors are at one another's throat.
So in your childhood, in your youth, were you brought up religious? Do you think some of the activism that characterized your later life stems directly from the environment in which you grew up?
Well, let's put it this way. I sometimes suspect that our own traditional beliefs, one can expatiate on that for a long time, but that structure of beliefs of understanding phenomena, and which means also understanding your different next-door neighbor, sort of mediated between these two arrogant religions, Christianity and Islam, and sort of created a kind of level ground of community existence. I think that is what has become missing in most parts of the world. They have no arbitrating, effective, traditional systems of spirituality which have survived the powerful onslaught of these so-called world religions.
You then came to study here in the UK, in England, and then you went back to Nigeria just at the point that it was becoming independent in 1916. It was not long after that you had your first spell in prison, which was then followed by a second one during the Civil War. What did you find when you first came back to Nigeria? Because it should be a moment of so much positive change. The colonial rule is over, you're in a new era. Did you find yourself immediately disappointed?
Well, let's put it this way, that actually coming outside your country teaches you sometimes, paradoxically, a lot more about your country because you're making comparison, and therefore you're recollecting certain factors, certain characteristics of your society, and you're beginning to examine those in relation to the environment in which you find yourself. But also, this also applies to politics. The front line nationalists, for instance, who won independence for us, they came here actually to negotiate. We were students here. We watched them. And it became apparent that some of them, in fact most of them, couldn't wait to step into the imperial boots of the departing imperators. And so you began to question, the question again, just what would independence mean if those who are leading are going to behave just like those we've thrown out? Then what is the meaning of liberation? What's the meaning of independence? And so I can reveal to you that as students, we thought our entire direction for the future was to go down south and liberate South Africa.
Yes, that was the big focus. And then you realized that closer to home, indeed in your own country, there was another battle to fight.
We said charity begins at home, because we saw the danger within. But believe me, when we were studying here, I used to come down from Leeds, others from Manchester, Bristol. We'd be porters during Christmas, we're distributing mail, railway station. We used to meet and talk a lot, politics, of course. And so we were able to encounter our leaders actually going around, interacting with us, interacting with our British people, see how they behave. And we learned a lot from that.
What did you learn in particular from that time that you were in prison? And I mean the 2-year period, which you spent almost completely in solitary confinement. You managed to write, I think, despite not being allowed to read or write anything. You found a way to do it.
Sorry, you're talking about when I was...
in prison in the 60s.
Yes. Yeah. You know, I have come to the conclusion that prison is a great university. You learn but a very fast one. You really fast. Of course, the first thing you want to do is to maintain your sanity, to retain your identity as a human being, to make sure that you're not rubbished, and you improvise a lot. You learn to improvise. It's one of the best ways of learning, just improvisation, just like in theaters, And so when I was deprived writing material and reading material, I realized what the purpose was, to break my mind. And so that was the first target, to find ways and means of preventing that. And eventually I was able to have books smuggled in, because they took all my books, as I told you, related to the trustee, some way. And one at a time he would get a book. I told him where it was stored, get a book out, and after reading it, I'll write between the lines. And also, toilet paper can be more useful than just the purpose it's meant for.
It formed the basis. Your writing in that time formed the basis of the book you wrote, "The Man Died."
Yes.
The title comes from a case you were following. There was a man who died.
Yeah, it came from one of those brutalities of the military, and he was a journalist. I can't even remember. Anyway, he was finally beaten to death. He died from his wounds when he was maltreated. But when I fled, I kept in touch indirectly with him and with some of his friends. And we had done everything to get him out before I left. And so while I was in exile, I got this cryptic telegram: the man died. And that's when I began to...
Yes. And you had a friend, actually, in the 80s, an investigative journalist, Delegiwa, who was also targeted and killed for doing his job, which tells us something about the decades of struggle you've experienced, 60s, 70s, 80s, even in the 90s when you were forced into exile. Tell us about Delegiwa and what he was working on.
Delegiwa was a friend, a colleague, a very bold journalist, real investigative journalist. And he was blown to pieces. He was sitting in his room, and in his sitting room, and a motorcyclist came with a parcel and delivered it to him. There was also a journalist with him that day, another journalist, who happened to bear the same name as I do, Soyinka, but no relation, whatever. And he opened the envelope, and as he opened it, he said, "Oh, this must be from the president." And those were his last words before he was blown up. He died actually on his way to the hospital. And we did everything to actually pursue the circumstances of his death. Even I remember announcing a prize, an award, a reward for anybody who gave us the necessary clues. We followed so many leads, but till today, that mystery remains an unsolved murder. But he died in the course of duty.
Yeah. Well, it's a reminder of so much of what we've been talking about today in the very present day, challenges and indeed journalists being killed right now. Take us right to the present day. When you see so many of your fellow Africans dying in some cases, certainly risking death to come to Europe, what goes through your mind?
Are you talking about the migrants?
Migration, yeah.
Going through the desert, going through... what I see is a monumental human failure to begin with. And then I see a kind of indifference, an alienation of leadership, political leadership on both sides. First of all, they should not be taking those risks. If they were fulfilled, if the circumstances were such that they could find self-fulfillment, even at the most basic level, they wouldn't be taking risks, crossing the desert, ending up at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Then, of course, what I call the host, the unwilling, graceless host countries, who have not sat down with the leaders of the donating nations and said, This is an issue that concerns us also. Because why are they leaving? It's not just the failure of immediate leadership, it's also because of the historical circumstances that led to the poverty of material, of development, etc., etc. So the colonizing nations also have a huge burden of debt and culpability in this. And I cannot understand why the two sides of leadership cannot recognize this as a major issue that requires a summit at the most productive, pragmatic level, not just theorizing across the table. One or two efforts I know were made to have this kind of conference, but it just petered out. Instead, what the receiving nations did was strengthen their patrol boats, their border guards, create the most unbelievable kind of special arrangement whereby they're negotiating with African leaders for holding pens. Britain is one of them. I think it's negotiating with Rwanda to send migrants over there.
Well, it's agreed it. It's agreed it with Rwanda. It has agreed it, not just negotiated. There's a treaty to that effect. Do you think Rwanda shouldn't be doing that? Do you think Rwanda should not be acting as a reception country?
Should have refused. Yeah, it's one thing. I admire the recovery of Rwanda. I think the president, Kagame, whom I know personally, is a man of vision and so on. But this is one horrendous error, in my view. Rwanda should never have accepted. Should have said, look, you are human beings, you run an organized society, you're a well-developed place. Let's solve this thing in another way. And I do not believe that this is beyond solution.
I want to turn to one other very underreported, if not completely under the radar to many journalists, certainly in Europe and the United States, and that is Russia's actions, particularly through the Wagner Group in the Sahel region, which I know you talked about earlier this year. What is happening that everyone watching should be conscious of?
Well, the Russians have been there for quite a while, always in denial. I think one of the early attractions was the discovery of uranium north of my country, I think in Mali, that whole area. And when we realized that there was a surrogate Russian government operating the Sahel, along the Sahel, and also down south, Mozambique, the eastern and central countries, we spoke to our leaders and said, well, if they've come to trade, there's no problem, it's free trade zone. But are you sure that there's not a new scramble for Africa going on? Now, this is part of the problem where truth calling, becomes problematic. You have this issue of the yet unfinished Cold War, the Eastern Bloc, the Western Bloc. Along the way, owing to the experience of the colonized nations, one side appears to be on the side, or at least acted in favor of the liberation of colonies. That section was largely the Eastern Bloc. And it's very difficult to get our leaders to understand that the Russia of those days is not, the Soviet Union of those days is not the Russia of today. Putin, I don't know where he came from, but he certainly wasn't part of the kind of leadership we relied on to enable us to throw out the Portuguese, the British, even the neo-colonial forces from other parts, the French, and so on. No, it's not the same. What you have is a feudalist throwback, regime. We had our own problem of secession, the Biafran War. It's difficult for me to accept the fact that one would be against colonialism from the West One would be against the civil war, which tore up Nigeria because a section which was violated decided to opt for autonomy, and yet say that it's all right for Russia to attempt to reabsorb Ukraine, and with such violent means. And today, 21st century. Now, when you make that kind of statement, they say, oh yes, you are a Western imperialism stooge. That's where this issue of truth comes in. It defies logic, that kind of approach. It defies even human empathy, because people have already predispositioned and have categorized, have labeled the rest of the world, and you are supposed to assume that this is a static condition, that it doesn't change.
Wole Soyinka, there is so much more we could talk to you about, but it is good to see that the questioning with which you began your life is very much still a part of it today. Happy birthday for next month. Thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome.